So I want to thank you for the opportunity and the Fred and everybody there to come up and share a little bit about Mr. Horn. That's going to be the only time you hear me use the term Mr. is in the very beginning. And he is an interesting guy. So we're going to talk. So I'm Dan Davidson. I've been the museum director for the Museum of Northwest Colorado for 27 years. I'm down in Craig, and I actually grew up in Craig. So I'm sort of a native to that end of the valley. So it's sort of fun to sort of see the changes and the things that go. And so it was sort of a fun thing for me to grow up in the same community and do a historical museum at the same place, because it gives you sort of an added, sort of a leg up on all that research project that you did. And you know a lot of the people and you bump into them, and so it sort of becomes more real. I think, at least to me, it has. So I'm not going to make it, and we might sort of break it. I want to make it pretty easy, and I don't want to be boring. I brought some books to show up that we have. And then we're also going to, in a little while, I'm going to pass some pictures of some of the principles of this particular talk around so that you can sort of have a face maybe to go with them. And so we're going to try that. But we'll sort of launch into the fact of Tom Horn. And I'm going to tie it into Browns Park, which, how many people have been in Browns Park? That'll help me. So almost everybody, or a goodly part of it. It's sort of a remote area. What you see today is not what it was 50, 60 years ago, and certainly not what it was before. There were huge changes because of land use that have happened to Browns Park. So you're going to see that sort of change. And it's really over land use that I really am going to say that it's going to be sort of a focus of this issue, because Browns Park is a very sheltered place from the storms that they have in winter. And so I'm going to do a little bit. So this will be going, and I might stop and say, okay, did I lose you? I have a tendency to get sort of into my subject, and I have a tendency to occasionally lose people. So that's not my intent. And I'll try to make a spot where there will be questions and answers at the end. I don't want to make it something that it's been confusing. So can everybody still hear me? I still got that? Okay. I want to continue to do that. So first we're going to talk about Tom Horn, who, I have lots of words for him, but I'll use the word enigma. So Tom Horn was born in Missouri in 1860, so just prior to the Civil War. He came from a family. His father had a tendency of solving his financial problems by leaving the state. And then sometimes those issues, because he was Pennsylvania, then it was Ohio, and then it was Missouri. And sometimes those issues sort of followed him. And he also had a rather bad temper, apparently. And so he believed in sort of like, spare the rod and spoil the child. And so Tom was growing up in a time when he was all about, and I'm going to mention some of these because I think it has a time of potential focus on what made him become what he was. What really changed him into that, morphed him into what he became by the time he was here, I don't know. I'm also going to say ahead of time, so Routt County today is only what it is. But in 1900 and before, in 1910, so 100 years before, it was all that was Moffat County. So that was all one. The county seat was at Hans Peak. So everything was sort of on the eastern side. The other part was largely not populated, except for really isolated areas. So that, when I say Routt County, I could be talking about what's currently Moffat County. But going back to Horn, so he also was extremely interested in outdoors, in hunting, and doing that. He had a dog by the name, I think Shep is the name, that he went everywhere with his favorite dog. And he got into, quite young, like very young, probably not even 10. He was sort of giving some immigrant kids that were just passing through, going into the West, sort of a hard time. They got sort of into a fight, and apparently he did okay on the fight. They turned around and shot his dog, which was his best friend when you really get into that point. And then apparently when his dad was going to give him a thorough thrashing, and he didn't like that much, he left the next day after that. So he was 13 and he headed west. And pretty much he did have some things to do with his family thereafter, but he would end up in Arizona and for quite a time doing a number of different kinds of things. Apparently became very well and very gifted at speaking Spanish, so he would be an interpreter. He was a packer as far as taking care of mules and things. And a lot of things that they don't know, he was somewhat instrumental in the fact that when Geronimo was finally captured in 1885-86, the final campaign against the Cherokee. He was one of the people involved in that. So he was a civilian, he wasn't in the military. And so he was involved in those type of activities. Then he would sort of drifted. He also started up a homestead. And he had a number of cattle and a number of horses and a partner. And before it was done, somebody, a group of people that he saw, had stolen all the cattle, stolen all the horses, and killed his partner. And so I'm not sure that some of those issues didn't sort of focus on the fact that he decided he would somewhat take the law into his own hands. I think that had some potential for how far he was willing to go. So he would then drift up into Wyoming after that period. He went to work for a Pinkerton detective agency, which was, the only way I can put it close to it was, sorry I did that. It was a private company, but today the only thing similar to it would be like the Central Intelligence Agency or the FBI. It was private, it came into being during the Civil War. They had helped, and when I say this, it's going to sound really bad, they were supposed to actually help protect the president. And if that's the case, they didn't do well with Lincoln, because they took security extremely lax after the Civil War even. So he was involved in that, went to work. Pinkerton was a national organization, but they had a Denver office, and so he would become involved in that. So he became really organized up in Wyoming, and what would be really rocking the Intermountain region during that time frame is the cattle barons, large cattle owners that had huge control of public domain and very little of their own private property. Those would be very small acreage compared to what they control. And so then you had the homesteading coming and going, getting more and more concentrated. As the last of the 1800s came into being, you just had more. And they were taking up the ranges, they would take up the springs, and they seriously impacted that cattle owner. And so that's part of what I think really tied this whole issue in. So you have Tom Horn involved in Wyoming, the Johnson County Wars in 1892. He was really good at rodeo. And then by the 1890s, at the end, at the time of the Spanish-American War, he was actually down in Cuba and was involved with the mules down there. And you see his name on there. But what he caught in Cuba was the yellow fever. That's going to have a serious impact on his health in the time prior to when he came here. So he was extremely ill at the time. He had lost a lot of weight prior to that. So he was involved in a lot of things. He became really good friends with some powerful cattle owners out of Wyoming, which tie into this region as well. And so that sort of sets the stage for Horn. So Horn's going to really show up in northwest Colorado in 1899, 1900. And then the rest of the story is you have Browns Park, which had been sort of a refuge from the winters. And anybody know that you have snow in the winter in northwest Colorado, right? You guys come here probably for skiing. And so the communication issue is always difficult because you have law enforcement up in this end, and you have Hans Peak. The sheriff could be up here, he could be in the lower end, that's now Moffat County. But you always had different ways of transporting people. If it's the winter, you got sleds. And then somewhere between Craig, Lay, Maybell, you had to go to actually wagons or horseback. You had to change your method of transportation because you didn't have the snow cover that you had. So Browns Park became this amazing place that sheltered from the winter storms. So the cattle herds that had come up out of Texas in the 1850s, 60s, 70s had used it. The mountain men would do it. The Native American tribes would use it because they have winter, but it's not near severe, and you don't have the snow cover that you have higher up. So the Bassett family, and I'm only going to sort of concentrate on the Bassets. Candace talked to me, and it's also Women's History Month, if I got the right month. Or it has been, or it's going to be, wherever that works. So we're really going to focus on a couple of particular ladies in this. So the Bassett family, Uncle Sam was there much earlier, but his family, his brother and his wife and several kids were from Arkansas. And they were headed west, but they spent a year or so in winter in Browns Park and ended up staying there. So Herbert Bassett and Elizabeth are going to be central figures in this particular place. And so they liked what they saw. So they actually came into the park in the 1870s. Ann Bassett would become one of the first white girls born in northwest Colorado in 1878. I will also sort of give you a little hope. Occasionally my dates might vary a year or two. So for you guys that are extremely picky, you'll say, and Paul, wherever he's at, I see his wife, he'll probably say, you messed up on that, Dan. You did that. But so you have that family that became part of that valley. And so I think it's really important to put that. You can't understate how they felt about it. So Browns Park was realized as a lawless place. I really don't think that was it. They usually took care of things within their own hands because they were so remote. And they did that. And so you have the same land use issue. And you have a family by the name of Hoy, H-O-Y, that came in, that took up a lot of the bottom lands. And then while Herb Bassett was the postmaster, and his wife was the one that ran the cattle operation. So they sort of switched possessions. He was a very powerful individual. And so there was a group of cowboys that would sort of hang around that, sometimes known as the Bassett Gang. That's sort of a new phrase that means a lot of things different than it would have been 3 years ago or 30 years ago. But she had this group of people. So we had this little problem going on between the Hoys, who got the best land in the bottom, and the Bassets were up on the slope. But they were right next to Cold Springs. And if you're used to it, there's huge land changes. When you come off Cold Springs, you got really dark, volcanic rock. And then you see these amazing springs come out at the bottom of that. So one of the places they got were those amazing springs. If you go down there today, you'll see the same springs coming out. And then you have Cold Springs on the top. And so you have that really good land in the winter to winter your cattle. And then you've got stuff up on the top of either Diamond or up on top of Cold Springs that have aspen. So you've got those two things fairly close to each other. So so the background is in 1890, apparently some of Elizabeth her cowboys decided to burn down some of the Hoy's buildings, and they went to prison for that. They actually went to Hans Peak for up here, were convicted. Isom Dart, the black cowboy, actually disappeared between Browns Park and Hans Peak and jumped bail. He never went to prison, while two of his other guys did. What we think the best known picture, and we'll pass that around in a couple of minutes, is probably taken by a black photographer in Denver. And I think that he probably left the area for a few years and hid out over there. He was actually back in Browns Park before his cohorts were out of the state pen in Canyon City. Sort of interesting. And you have Matt Rash, who was out of Texas, as well as Isom Dart. And if you ever study on Isom Dart, they say he's Ned Huddleston. I'm pretty confident, like 100% at this point, that he in fact was Isom Dart. His folks, he was born into slavery in Texas. His parents were slaves. We found those guys near Fort Worth area. And the people that knew him as kids also did oral histories that he was Ned Huddleston. That he wasn't Ned Huddleston. Even the son of the guy that was behind the book that says he was Ned Huddleston says he's Isom Dart. So that's just the way history goes as we get into that. So they were both out of, and Isom Dart and Matt Rash had come out of Texas in the cattle drives and probably showed up in the 1880s and showed up. So you've got that. Matt Rash was the head of the Browns Park Cattlemen's Association. And in 1895, he had been arrested and charged with cattle rustling, come to Hans Peak, and was acquitted. So the cattle guys could not get those guys convicted very often because of the circumstances. Because really nobody liked the big cattle owners too much anyway. They weren't everybody's favorite. And we'll talk a little bit about Ora Haley, that's going to be the central piece. So that sort of sets the stage. Why they were picked on, I don't know, per se. But in Browns Park, there were two areas that are extremely important. The Bassett place was the post office for the location called Lador. Lador was the name of the post office. The Jarvie place was usually for the western side into Utah of the post office. So the only way to communicate was the mail. So you had to go to those little places to get your mail every week, every so often. It was really the only way for communication. So the Bassett place on the eastern side, and very few ways in and out easily of that park. And again, all there was a trail from the eastern side of Route County into Browns Park. Just a very poor trail. So you've got Tom Horn, all of a sudden, 1899, 1900, shows up at the Bassett place. and sort of pretends to just be probably looking for work, a cattle buyer, and he gets acquainted with Matt Rash, and sort of takes up as a helper, might have been involved with a cook, and there were, early on people were not really skeptical about it, but clearly on there's a number of different sources that people have used for doing that, but he got into where they treated him like one of Brown's Park people. And so he comes upon a time when Dart and Matt Rash were actually arguing over the fact of this steer that he was butchering, and it had, and I lost his name. It had Spicer's name on it, his brand on it. So it wasn't their cow. And so they had this big discussion about, okay, if last time you'd been here and you took all those cattle to market, if I had been there and had my gun, I'd gotten my share. So there was sort of a rift between Dart and Matt Rash, even though they were good friends. And so Tom Horn observed that. And he'd been sent in by, there's lots of smoking guns in this after even 110 years, probably by the most powerful cattle owners, Ora Haley being central, several other local ones, maybe Charlie Ayers, maybe Whiff Wilson, maybe a few other people. Those guys were right on the Wyoming-Colorado border. Haley had a huge operation up by Laramie, and he also had a huge presence in Routt County. The 2-bar was his horse. The brand for his horses was a heart. For the cattle, it was the 2-bar. And so he becomes central in the history of Northwest Colorado. So they wanted to do that, but I hate to tell you this, you're going to hear one of my prejudices. I'm not sure they were being investigated because of their crimes. I'm not sure it wasn't because of land use. And I think what they were really trying to do was put the settler, the homesteader, in their place to try to control the range. And Haley had not been able to move into Browns Park. And if you're used to that area, the Little Snake River is where he had a huge sort of footprint. The Little Snake River area was large. There's still a 2-bar ranch there, of course, by different people. And then between Mayville and Craig, there's a little place called Lake, Colorado. His horse camp was at Lake. He also had little camps really near Craig. So that's just like anybody. They had huge groups of public domain, but they only had a few different locations to do it out of. So I really think they were saying it wasn't Haley's range, and yet he seems to be behind this issue. So gradually, what happened is Horn seems to have worked under 3 different premises, and he was never acquitted of this. So here I am. I convicted Tom Horn without a judge or a jury. So I've done a little bit of what I've accused him of. So just be aware of that, because he was never charged with the crimes of killing people in Browns Park. And so we don't have that for him. So I'm sort of convicting him in absentia. He's dead, so I can do that, I guess. I don't think, and in fact that'll get to be a little dab of our story. So we've got him getting more strongly involved with the deal with Matt Rash. So the first thing he did was he put up letters on people's doors that said, leave Browns Park in this length of time or you're dead. So I would say this man worked under 3 different principles. Fear was his first one, and to change that. The term that became known in Steamboat Pilot and the Craig papers was there was a reign of terror in western Routt County. So he made everybody scared to death. And so the best way to handle that is to actually follow through. So Matt Rice had been to town. Again, the shipping point was the UP up in, for this area was Rollins. Then it was the area down in, so it's going to be Rock Springs, Green River, when you're in the western part, where they would have done all their shipping. So he'd just come back from town, visited at the Bassett place, went up to his house, and apparently there's a good chance that he had actually had dinner with the guy that had assassinated him. Really close. Little close, small cabin, 12 by 14, and apparently the shot was very close, and he got up and tried to get to his bed, which was sort of a built-in bed in the corner of the place, and died. And he lost so much blood. The story was that he had tried to maybe make a message or write something about his killer and wasn't able to do it. So this is July 4th or 5th. Nobody else got up there for another 4 or 5 days before they found him. The body was in a really bad condition by that particular point. He actually, so they wrapped their faces and basically took him right outside his cabin, dug a grave, and buried him just right away. And then tried to do some trailing to find out. His horse had been killed as well, shot in the forehead, with his aged chickens still hanging around the saddle. So it wasn't like he was wanting anything, it was purely an attempt. So more of the letters had shown up. One of the Davenports was supposed to have got them. Some of the Bassett family were ones to receive those. And so that just sort of, and then Tom Horn left. Tom Horn left the area and sort of let that sort of work on people to know that his letters were serious. He ends up going writing, and the other thing he could do, and he had help from a cattleman to do this, is his horses were strategically sort of staked out as he went. There was one of those staked out at Lake, at the 2-bar, and so he would ride very quickly, and they'd say, gee, he couldn't have done it because he was over here, and he couldn't have been over here. So there were these huge long rides involved to have that actually happen. Or mail was written by somebody else and shipped in. And so he ends up at Baggs, Wyoming. And so one of the things he apparently did after he had killed somebody was to go on a large drunk. And so he ends up there, and there were 2 brothers by the name of, Kelly. Did I get it right? I'm looking at Paul. Anyway, these 2 guys, and see, you'll get names. You'll have to read more about it. Knew Kelly, and anyway, they sort of took him on at the Bailey Saloon in Baggs. And so Tom Horn got a huge knife rake up through his neck and throat. And the story was that if it had been a little deeper, he'd have died just from the blood loss. But it ended up being. So he takes a little while just to heal up from the knife wound, as he did. The story was that he actually went to a little place, if you've ever been there, called Juniper Hot Springs, which is south of Lake, to sort of heal up a little bit for a little while. And then he did a little other tour, probably back up into Wyoming. He goes back to Browns Park a little later in the summer, after he's got healed up, and there is proof that he actually had those scars. And it's sort of funny, because of the connection with that, the museum has an original picture of Bob Meldrum, which is one of Tom Horn's cohorts that we aren't going to go into, because of the connection of just knowing that guy that knew that, because he and Meldrum are somewhat the same cloth as far as their behaviors. So he goes back into the park. There's more letters during this point, more fear that has been generated. And then the other thing that starts to happen is he actually, I think, is the person that actually shoots people and misses. So there was a guy by the name of Longhorn Thompson and his family. They lived on the Snake River, just below where the 2-bar would be today. In fact, it would be part of the 2-bar. And he's riding along, and he finds out that he jumps into the willows on Little Snake and jumps into the willows on Hyde where he'd been killed. There's a young boy by the name of Banks that lived in Craig and lived at Lake. He apparently is involved, in fact, of overhearing a couple of the cattlemen talking about the assassination of Matt Rash in the livery in Craig. And they didn't know he was in there. He was behind the stall, he was taking care of his horses, and he tried to act like he didn't hear it, but he's out on the range, and he has a bullet hit the horn of the saddle and go through it. Now, the sheriff, who at this point was Farnham, said it was nothing. It was just a stray bullet. Well, a lot of people thought, no, it wasn't. So that was another part of the fear piece that was really involved in that. So after that happened, and some people think that it was actually Josie Bassett, her first husband, last name was McKnight, that he was also on the wanted list of somebody that had to move out of the area. That it had been McKnight's cabin up on Cold Springs. So I have to ask you, I'm going to pass these around. So I'm going to hold them up. Can I have you hold that? And I'll do one at a time. This is Tom Horn. And there'll be some things on the back, which Sarah helped us with. So this is when he's in jail, in prison up in Cheyenne, awaiting trial. So we'll start those around. This one's going to go last. This is Isom Dart, and he's still buried. I was going to ask you, how many of you guys have ever been up on Cold Springs Mountain? Okay, not near as many. It's private property. You can get permission from either Raptopoulos or Dickinson's. His grave's up there, and all forwarded with just logs banked up in an aspen grove with his name. So he's buried up there. This is Matt Radish. He was supposed to actually be cousins of Davy Crockett. He's buried down in Hood County, Texas. And on his tombstone it says, killed, and this is sort of a paraphrase, killed in cold blood at his cabin on Cold Springs Mountain, Browns Park, Colorado. Actually it says Route County, Colorado. And that's what's on his thing. So he's the first victim. And then as we get a little farther, we're ready to jump into this. This is Ann Bassett, which was the first girl born in northwest Colorado, as far as white child, probably. And so she grows up. This event's going to change her life for the rest of her life. She already had the personality, but she's never going to be the same after this particular part. And hopefully they come back to you. And this is at the end. This is Anne, just a couple of years, well, maybe 5 or 6 before she died. Taken. She lives an extremely varied and colorful life because of who and what she did. This event with Tom Horn, though, is going to change everything. Nothing's going to be the same. And we'll jump back into that. So come later in the year, in October, November, Isom Dart had also received that letter. Whether it was justifiably for him or not, I don't know. But he got it. And so he had a lot of people staying with him. He was going to try to get his cattle sold before he left. And he had a number of young men staying with him to sort of defend him. So one morning, they trail out of the cabin, and he instantly is dead as he hits the ground. One bullet, and he's dead. That's all it took. And there's always the discussions. It created rumor. Horn had come back and said, though, Isom Dart was really the one that killed Matt Radish. He put a lot of other rumors into that particular play. People were beginning to really discuss who this guy was before this really happened. And of course, I saw a thing in the Steamboat pilot, not today's, but the 1900s, say that there was nobody to go after, and it implied there was nobody to go after him because he was black. That's not true. Isom Dart was an amazingly well-liked individual, fit into the community amazingly well. And the museum in Craig, if you're interested in more, and I'll show you some books at the end here, the museum has the cuffs, the leather cuffs that are on his wrists that were on Dart when he was killed. We just acquired those last year. It's the only thing that I know of that can go back from 1900 for that particular period of time. So both men had a thing. What happened though, they both had estates. Isom Dart's estate was totally used up and gone before there was any probate. There was no known heirs. Matt Radish's gets to be complex because Anne comes up and says that she was actually engaged to Matt Radish. To be honest with you, and if any of you guys are Bassett Family, I'd ask you to forgive me for this. I think she made it up. I think the key with the Bassets and the way they view Browns Park is that there's a close association. She'd grown up with him. He's part of the family. And so therefore, his stuff is ours. I think that's more likely to be the case. But his family showed up, his brother and his aged father. The problem I have with the aged father is he was only about 60 when they said that about him. And that's my real problem, is how come he's a really aged guy and he's only 60? And he made the trip up, they make him like a senile old man and he's only 60. So I have a problem with that. So I guess you can guess close to my age. So anyway, they come up and say, no, it's our estate, we've got it. And so Anne had actually filed for that estate up here in Hans Peak. And I think one of the things that I'm going to say, and she finally gave in. She agreed with the Radish family. She made some kind of settlement. But this weird thing happens in 1901 or 2. There was a Steamboat attorney by the name of McClellan. And he files a big injunction against her in 1902 for like $1,200, which would be equivalent to $20,000 or $30,000. I really think that was probably her legal expenses for that, for sort of trying to promote the fact that she was the intended wife of Matt Rash. I think that put some financial pressures on her after all that settled. And so from then on, and then within just a very short time after this, Tom Horn either accidentally kills a boy by the name of Willie Nickel or meant to get his father, but he still killed him. And Tom Horn was still drinking, and I said the reason that it sort of set him on a course, his view of human life had become extremely shallow. And apparently if he thought you had done it, you were guilty, you had the death sentence. And so apparently he got $500 per person when he did that. There's talk that he actually had a little trouble getting his money for Ice and Dart because it was supposed to be somebody else. There's one writing when Billy Brown bought out Ora Haley in 1909. The story was that Ora Haley showed him an envelope. And he said, "These are the best 5 cattle rustlers that I ever knew of." And they were the pay vouchers that paid the money for their deaths. So I would tell you that Ora Haley and certain cattle owners were complacent and as guilty in some ways of this whole thing as what Tom Horn was, because they were the money behind it. He wasn't doing it as a volunteer project. So I think there was more than a small amount of cattle rustling involved that really sort of powered it. And you would see that it, and so Tom would go on and brag to a guy by the name, if you see a book called Cowboy Detective by Charlie Siringo, still in print, he uses a little name because he was trying to change names, that a guy by the name of Tom Corn actually wiped out rustling in Browns Park in one summer. And the reason he did corn was he didn't want to get sued and didn't use horn. By the way, I forgot to tell you, when Tom came into Northwest Colorado, he went by the name of Tom Hicks. That was his alias. By the time he killed Ice and Dart, is what I'm going to say, he actually swore out a warrant on behalf of McKnight and actually used his name Tom Horn. And so he was actually went into the Huns Peak, into the sheriff equivalent, and swore out the warrant and signed his own name. So he'd become more bold in that. So he's involved in that. Shortly after, I think the cattlemen in Wyoming had realized he was becoming a liability, because he came close to a reporter telling him that he actually had done the murders here. He'd been involved in murders up at Jackson Hole area. There's a story that potentially he had killed 2 people that were innocent out on the Red Desert because they made a mistake. And so he'd gotten extremely lax in the view of it. So they tricked him, and if you've read the stories, he was drunk, or heavily, he had drank a lot. And so they had a transcriptionist, wrong name, in the room beside him as he told everything that he had done. And of course today we couldn't use that. You can't incriminate yourself. But they did that. So lots of trials, lots of different holdings and different people trying to protect him and get him, but he did. Just before his 43rd birthday, he was executed by hanging up in Cheyenne. And he became bigger than life almost immediately. There were people that still say that he wasn't executed by hanging. That in fact it was another person, it was a dummy, that was really the case. At the time, it's a rather unusual thing. One of his brothers was living in Boulder, Colorado, and so he's buried in Boulder, which is not the place you'd think Tom Horn was buried at. But I've never seen it. I've been in Boulder, but I should have gone and looked at it, but I haven't. So you have that Old West, and it was might makes right. It was the cattle owners or the railroad magnates that didn't like the competition for the range. And I think that was a huge part that played. And so I'm going to tie it back to sort of, as we get closer to the end of it, back to Ann Bassett. And so because of that, she started a personal vendetta against Ora Haley. And for the rest of her life, she would do everything she could to make his life miserable. Now, did she really hurt him? I don't think so. In 1904, she would marry his foreman, Hyde Bernard, and the stories will tell you that he immediately was fired. That really isn't true. He wasn't immediately fired. But later on, sort of did do that. they were still married later. So the first thing that happened, Ann Bassett didn't care. So in 1909, a few years later, Haley bought out the Hoy holdings in Browns Park, and he became a major holder in that area. And in 1909, he'd actually sell that out. I mean, 1950, give or take, he'd actually sell that out. But in 1911, guess who the first criminal trial in Moffat County, Colorado was? Anybody remember? Ann Bassett for cattle rustling. So she and her husband were at the Smelter Ranch, and so they had a big trial. These women, you can say what you want about them, and Josie had the same issues, they would never been convicted by a jury. They had apparently an amazing personality that were very warming and very genuine, and the only people that didn't like them were cattle owners, and sometimes their ex-husbands. Sometimes the ex-husband. So she was, it was a hung jury the first time, and then, so Ann was scared to death because there was a guy by the name of Bob Meldrum of the Bags, and he actually does somewhat assassinate one of the cowboys from Craig that's working up on Little Snake River in 1912. His name was Chick Bowen. And so she leaves the country. Now her husband thought that she was just leaving for a few weeks. Instead, she left for a few years. And he sort of took exception to that because she wasn't there. She actually spent time in Mexico. She was going here and there. In 1912, she was ill and didn't even make it back for the next trial, so they did a continuance. 1913, she comes back in Craig again, and this time she's acquitted. They could not nail those Bassett ladies for nothing. And guess the next trial that happened after the cattle rustling trial was the divorce trial. Because Hy Bernard did not like being abandoned. And basically, the transcripts are amazing because both of them were looking for money, and he was a broken up, badly injured old cowboy, and he couldn't really work much anymore. So he didn't have the way to support her, and she didn't really have, so it didn't turn out extremely well to do that. And she was still fixed in the community. You know, the census taker was fairly well known. In 1910, they took a census. Guess who took the census for the Browns Park precinct of Rock County? Ann Bassett and Bernard. And so, amazingly enough, she sort of changed her handwriting. She has an amazing thing that was different than it was earlier. So she meets up with a guy by the name of Frank Willis. And they would spend the rest of their time sort of traveling around for the rest of her life. She found out in 1940 or 30, after all these years, that the Bassetts, Browns Park's also a difficult place to survey, that they had never actually owned the land where her parents' cabin was. So they went back. She did a sort of a supplementary one in 1940. She finally got the deed for the place that her parents actually had lived since the 1880s. And so, and one of the interesting other stories, because Josie Bassett's her own story, there was a brother by the name of Ebb that he was also a little bit in and out of trouble occasionally. So he had a girlfriend by the name of Maddie Hughes. So he actually, on the way to court in Craig in 1920s, he takes his own life. He swallows poison. But his girlfriend stayed on in the cabin. And in all the research that we've done, she wrote to her niece, and we ended up with a lot of the letters at the museum. She writes to her niece because she couldn't get Maddie Edwards, to move out of the house, realizing this is the house that she was raised in. And if you go to Browns Park and you see these massive cottonwoods that are still, and poplars that are there, they're still there from the 1880s. It's amazing how old they are. The spring still is amazing. She built a small cabin afterwards. She actually told her niece, I guess the only way I'm going to get her out of there is to burn the cabin down. And so she burned it. So this lady, once she set her mind on something, was not going to move. And so, like I said, from there on, she wrote some neat histories. She did some others. But she never would let up on those other pieces. It polarized her, the fact that somebody's life could be taken with one person being the detective, the judge, the jury, the executioner. And it forever changed who she really was. She would never really change from that again. So she lives on until 1956. So she's been gone for just in here a few weeks. She's been gone for 61 years. I think it's only fair. And the reason I sort of tied it is Tom Horn had a huge impact on Northwest Colorado. And it changed that family. But the pioneers, that spirit of that Bassett, it didn't change their personality. And if you look on the records in Moffat County, Colorado today, it is still being taxed in the name of the Ann B. Willis estate. So this 12, 13 acres is still in her name. And she put a really will together that said it could never be bargained or traded, it had to stay in the Bassett name. Nobody in the family has ever gotten into changing that. So it's landlocked today, but her name, who else can say that? Her name, she'd only be, if she was born in 78, she'd only be 30 some years old, and her names are still on the tax rolls. So she had longevity when it comes to those particular issues. So I hope that just sort of touched the basis of it. I wanted to toss a couple of things out, and then there'll be questions. So The Basset Woman is a book that was done a number of years ago, but it's the best one on the Bassett family, still in print. I know when I talked to Tamara, they can have them at the Tread. If they don't, there's another brand new Tom Horn book that came out a year or two ago. There's actually a new Tom Horn book just last year that's on his trial only, if you get interested in it. This is probably the best book ever done. Larry Ball did it a couple of years ago. And then a lot of you might have heard of John Burroughs. So we still have a lot of these at the museum. They're available even though they've been out of print for a long time. They usually sell for around $60. Nobody else did a better job on the history of Northwest Colorado than Burroughs. I disagree with him a lot, by the way, but he did a lot more research and he got to talk to the right people. Nobody else could have done what he did. So if you're interested, those are some sort of interesting things. So I guess I'd open it up because I don't want to take any longer and see how that works for questions. So you do have that.
We do beer break.
Do that.
So before we do questions, if anybody needs to get another beer, this is a good time to do that because I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of questions. So we didn't want you to feel like you're interrupting, which you're not. We want you to get beer. Let the beer flow. So if you'd like to go get a beer, use the restroom. We'll take maybe a 5-minute break if that's okay with you.
Thanks.
And then we'll come back for questions. And 5 minutes will actually give you some time to think.
Okay, so go ahead and tell me that again, and I probably missed it. I probably do what I do. I wander. And so the way it came into play is he used that riff that he said he had seen. He used it, and then it gave some idea to it. They'd actually come up out of Texas together. They'd been involved with the Bassett family for 10 years. I don't think it was a serious rift at all. I think Horn magnified it to make him seem more likely to shift the blame to somebody else. I think that's how. I'm sorry I sort of missed that. One of the things that came up in the discussion is there is going to be a new book out on Ann Bassett, most likely this year by Diane Corris. She's just getting done. Hopefully it'll be out by the end of the year. Any other questions? Okay. It was that fine-tuning pickiness of me. You know, that it's like you get, Burroughs worked at a time when you didn't have historic newspapers online. And you didn't see, and so he missed some really interesting points that he just sort of made over. One of my biggest research projects is a guy by the name of Bob Meldrum. He's a nasty character, equally bad. But I'd like to meet him because he's so complicated. I'd like to have met him. Horn, I don't know if I wanted to. And so he makes Meldrum out to be a drunk, stupid guy. And he wasn't. He was extremely talented, extremely dangerous, and he plays a huge part in Western history that nobody's ever done, and he just makes him out to be a drunk. And he probably had an alcohol problem, make no question about it. He was more than, they actually in the Denver paper call it, he worked for the mine owners, and he was a deputy sheriff, like Horn was. There's correspondence between them, and he said that that was all made up, and it wasn't. There's correspondence that they found now that tie the two very close together. Probably did cases together. So it's those little things, because he used a very broad stroke on a huge subject matter. So nobody's ever going to do better than he did. What's that? Oh, okay. The question was, what were the difference with John Burroughs? What did I sort of take exception to? And I used the issue of Bob Meldrum as one of them, because he just didn't see that right. His source said it wasn't, and in fact, he was far more than he makes him out in his book. Any other questions?
Do you know the location of where Tom Horn was hired by the county?
Was hired?
Yeah, he was obviously hired by the county. Was that in Cheyenne? Was that?
There's some stories that it was Denver, and there's some stories that Charlie Ayers, who had a ranch right up on 4 Mile so on the Colorado-Wyoming border north of Craig, that he was sort of the money person behind that. The problem with that is Charlie Ayers had a huge accident with a horse in Craig that almost killed him, and he was laid up for like a year. So it's sort of hard to know if that's really true or not. I would have a tendency to think the decision probably came out of Denver, because Haley had one, or Laramie, where they headquartered. Okay, I saw somebody else.
They were talking about doing something, doing something.
Okay, I messed up. You caught me on another mistake. Yeah, so, no, I appreciate it. So the question was that I mentioned Rice was in the stable and did that. I meant to say a guy by the name of Banks, his last name was, young boy, was in there. So I didn't mean, if I said Rice, it was a misspoken word. And so it was a young boy that was just taking care of his horse in the stable in Craig, and that he had overheard Charlie Ayers talking with Hy Bernard about this assassination. And it's sort of weird that how could a man Bassett marry Hy Bernard? It's like, what was going on there? I honestly think she did it because she felt trapped. It's my new theory. You've heard it the first year, because of money. She had no way to get out from the debt that she had levied against her by the court in Rock County. And she felt forced into doing that. And so she took advantage of it to some extent. So I don't know if I think that happened. So he was hoping he didn't hear that. That came from several courses. It comes out of the historic papers. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it almost cost us his life. But it's that 3-part that Horn used. It was the fear, and it was almost missing. I don't think Horn would have missed. Horn would not have missed unless he meant to miss. I think he was too good a shot. Candace. Oh, that's a tough one. She said, do you think he killed Willie Nickel? I do. I really do. I think he might have meant to kill his father instead, but I think Horn had gotten extremely sloppy. Life meant nothing to him, and he'd been really sick. He had really, and it was about money, and I think he got really sloppy. Now, I know Chip Carlson would absolutely get furious at me, the guy that wrote Blood on the Moon, for saying that. I know today that Tom Horn would not have been convicted because we changed laws where you can't self-incriminate yourself. They couldn't have used all that testimony against him. So he wouldn't have been, he wouldn't have been executed today. No debate. I still think he did it. But, where did he live when he was doing? One of his headquarters was the Iron Mountain Ranch, managed by John Copel up in Wyoming. That was sort of the headquarters that he would use as he sort of made this. So they have letterhead that says the Iron Mountain Ranch that Tom Horn wrote on letterhead. So it was sort of, that was his ranch up in Wyoming that he would make that. Well, he sort of did that, but he made these things extremely fast. So he could be clear across the country because he had several relays. He used the same concept that the Wild Bunch did to get away from the bank robbers. they had laid out these horses in this relay so he could get as far away from the scene of the crime as possible, where everybody knew it was impossible for him to do it. And he couldn't have. So he used that very well to try to appear that and Pinkertons were extremely good at tracking down. So he learned that he was a tracker. You know, he did that. He helped bring down Geronimo. So he was extremely good at that. And so it was all about sort of smoke and mirrors to make it. Yeah, he'd do that, but he'd also do it very leisurely. And he'd let fear work. I don't know about you, but the way to make that work is not to have anything show up for a week or a month. And you just get worse. It's like if your mother, I didn't have this, if she says, you're really going to get it when your father gets home. You know, he used that in a very major form and that's why he could say that he wiped out wrestling in Grounds Park in 1 year. Because he did it. So Ann Bassett's oldest brother was Sam. And he left at that time and never came back to Browns Park. This Sam Bassett actually had 4 boys, lived on the West Coast, and they're still Bassetts, they're descendants of that family, but he never came back to Browns Park and he left. And there were other people that never came back to the park because of that warning. Really changed. Yeah. I didn't hear that. My hearing's not getting any better either. Right. And so this Bassett family was out of Pennsylvania. And so the fun part that we actually got was we actually had letters from Herb to his Bassett. So it's Bassett for the spelling. And so, but she grew up in Arkansas. He was out of Pennsylvania. So there were 2 of those senior ones. There's a number of relatives. One of Josie's sons had children. The other one didn't. But Crawford had 8 kids. So in the region, most of them are related from Crawford McKnight, that lived down in Jensen, Utah. And so there's a large amount of family that comes from that one. And then George Bassett was the baby brother, and he actually stayed on the place and died down at Browns Park. And he had one daughter, Edna Bassett Hayward. And we got a tremendous amount of stuff from her son, Paul Hayward, who's deceased now. Letters, personal letters, with amazing material. And pictures, the picture of Matt Rice, we have the original came from that family. And it's got his initials, he wrote his name on the back, it's M.M. Rice. Any questions? More? Go ahead.
So you mentioned how basically they took a lot of our in because there was cousins and their grandparents. How many were the sheriff's office at the time?
2 people. 2 people. So they usually would have, at the time of the big thing that happened with Lanton Tracy, the sheriff was Nyman, who sort of had the Yampa area, and then the deputy sheriff was Farnham that lived north of Ray. That was it. And so they had to issue warrants, they had to travel over the county. It was amazing. And they had to, so if they had a jury trial, they apparently had to even give all those summonses around this huge, monstrous county. 2 people. And they were only part-time. So I signed in. Yeah, absolutely, she would have.
What was the question?
So, did Ann Bassett know Butch Cassidy? So one of the stories that after Butch had been involved in the Telluride robbery in 1889, one of the places he hid out was in Browns Park with the Bassets. So yeah, absolutely. The story was that she was sort of a girlfriend, that the girlfriend would have been Josie, the older sister of his. Yeah, he would have been. Any others? You guys have been a great audience. One more question.
You said that the women were too charming to get convicted in court. How many trials did they have? Just one?
Well, Anne had those 2. She was so how many trials did the Bassett girls have? Was the question, because they were too charming. So Anne had the one that it was a hung jury in 11. 13 was the other. So Josie Bassett never got in trouble for the way some of her husbands disappeared. one particular one, I think she was a nice lady, okay? I can't believe she actually poisoned him. But he died. They think it was just an alcohol poisoning issue. So that was Nick Wells. Charlie Ranny did fine. I think Charlie was number 2. And then Nick Wells. And then there's another one. And then she lived with a guy for quite a few years. She just finally gave up on doing that. So if you give up with this, if you go to Dinosaur National Monument and you go to the quarry, don't miss the fact that you go to Josie Bassett Morris's cabin. The spot is spectacular with the rocks behind it and the location. And even though the background's different, it feels a little like Browns Park because of the spring that comes up there. And so she would spend the rest of her life really there. Josie lived until 1964 after all of her siblings, I think, were gone, and yet she was the oldest. So she would live there, and so she had a problem. So if you come to the museum, you'll see a cowboy on the north side. His name's Jim Robinson. He was a 2-bar cowboy. He was one of the first white children born at Craig. One was still Yampa. That's the old name for Craig, was Yampa. And he was born in 1886 out there. So anyway, he actually was neighbors with Josie down on Cub Creek in Utah. And he really didn't like losing his cattle to Josie, who thought it was okay that she took some of his cattle. So he actually had her arrested, hauled into court in Vernal, and she was acquitted. So so that's the two that I think of right off. Both sisters had those issues. You just couldn't nail them down on any kind of a trial because everybody knew they couldn't have done what they were accused of. And I sort of have to end this with Anne. It's not fair because I love to met Anne. She, in one of her autobiographies, said that I did everything they accused me of and more. So I think that's a good way to end that part. Any other questions? Again, I thank you very much for your attention.